Bruce, welcome back. It's good to have you. And
It's good to be back.
shedding light on the Hermit Kingdom for us.
Right, and thank you for the invitation. Well, I'm back from South Korea, but it's been about 2 weeks, so I can't claim jet lag. So if I'm fuzzy-headed, it's just due to my innate abilities. As I was walking over here from the Heritage Foundation, I was struck by, the absolutely gorgeous, cloudless weather, which is exactly as it was 14 years ago today. An empty sky until the smoke began to rise. So not only must we never forget that day, but we must also never forget that there are others out there who continue to want to threaten and who do threaten us, which brings me to the topic of today's discussion, which is North Korea and Iran. So the international agreement with Iran generated a lot of speculation, particularly in the South Korean media, as whether there would be similar negotiations with North Korea. There are so many similarities between Pyongyang and Tehran, and also if you look more broadly that the Obama administration softened the U.S. policy towards Burma and Cuba and now Iran, why not North Korea? But I think while a desperate, dramatic Hail Mary pass is very exciting to end a football game, it's neither likely or justified in the diplomatic realm at the tail end of an administration. And really, from a practical point of view, a political point of view, I think time really is running out on the Obama administration. They really only have a year and a half, which is far too short to try to begin and bring to completion a very difficult, very contentious agreement with North Korea. And really, veterans of the Clinton administration, such as Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman, would remember how difficult it was and the ultimate failure of bringing a missile agreement to closure with North Korea at the tail end of the Clinton administration. Although Ms. Sherry Albright claimed that they were this close to an agreement, the truth is there was still a huge gap between what North Korea was demanding and what the U.S. wanted. So I really think from a political point of view, particularly in the hyper-partisan environment now as we're already in the presidential campaign. But more importantly, I don't detect really an intent within the administration to try to get an agreement with North Korea. If we think back in 2009, there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of optimism that simply by not being George Bush, that the Obama administration would create a dramatic improvement in bilateral relations with North Korea and then bring the six-party talks back to the table. But they were met very quickly with a long-range missile test, a nuclear test, et cetera, so that it led to a real souring of the viewpoint of North Korea within the administration. Eventually, they then came back with the Leap Day Agreement of February 2012. The speedy failure of that, only 2 weeks after the agreement, North Korea said, yeah, we're going to violate UN Security Council resolutions again. That sort of blowing up in their face so quickly after the agreement really has soured the administration. So I think with sort of two big attempts at engagement having failed, there really is little appetite for getting back on the horse that's kicked them in the teeth. But really, of course, the biggest obstacle to any kind of agreement with North Korea is North Korea. Their unceasing threats against the U.S. and its allies, their cyber attack, their threats of a 9/11 type attack against anyone who would go to the movie theater to see that movie, it hardly creates an atmosphere conducive to diplomatic engagement. And not that there was any doubt, but Pyongyang publicly rejected any interest in following Iran into denuclearization negotiations. The North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared in July that Pyongyang is not interested at all in dialogue to discuss the issue of making it freeze or dismantle its nukes unilaterally. It's not a plaything to be put on the negotiating table. And that statement is consistent with now years of the regime saying the six-party talks are null and void, and that they dismiss any possibility that they will denuclearize, which is the sole objective of the six-party talks. For example, last year, the powerful National Defense Commission, a very important government entity in Pyongyang, asserted that nothing will be more foolish than trying to force the army and people of North Korea to lay down the treasured sword of nuclear weapons. And Kim Jong-il declared in February of this year, we're unwilling to sit down with U.S. mad dogs anymore. And then Kim instead vowed to increase the production of precision and miniaturized nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery, and unceasingly develop nuclear weapons technology to actively develop more powerful and advanced nuclear weapons and firmly bolster the nuclear armed forces both quantitatively and qualitatively. So there you have it. Now, I think Iran and North Korea really are linked in so many ways. There are a lot of similarities. The nature of the regimes, the manner in which they treat their people, the threat they pose to the United States and to their neighbors, and the way in which the U.S. negotiated with them. And unfortunately, both Pyongyang and Tehran learned that alternating provocative behavior and a perceived willingness to negotiate enabled them to manipulate the international community into timidity about imposing penalties and acquiesce to their repeated violations. So one would have hoped that Washington had learned a number of lessons from its negotiations with North Korea and applied them to the negotiations with Iran, but such was not the case. So let me offer what I see as 10 lessons from negotiating with North Korea and now, unfortunately, also learned from negotiating with Iran. The first is that violations make a shaky foundation for negotiations. Nuclear diplomacy with both North Korea and Iran were precipitated by their violating previous agreements and previous UN resolutions, which is really hardly the basis for confidence that they'll abide by new accords. The second, don't do your end zone dance too early. The Clinton administration officials initially claimed that the 1994 agreed framework had solved the North Korean nuclear problem. And then it was later confirmed that Pyongyang had already begun a uranium-based nuclear weapons program by the early 90s or perhaps even the late 1980s, even before North Korea signed the agreed framework. And then that uranium program violated not only the agreed framework that they were going to sign, but also the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty, the IAEA safeguards, the Inter-Korean Denuclearization Accord, et cetera. Three, a bad cop is good to have. The agreed framework was not really the immaculate conception that the diplomats may now claim it to be. Talk of war with North Korea was very widespread and very real in the mid-1990s. And Clinton administration officials claimed they were discussing or debating attack options when surprised by the preliminary agreement that was brought back by Jimmy Carter. The Clinton administration officials were working at their desks, looked up to see a live interview from with Wolf Blitzer and Jimmy Carter in Pyongyang, and then that's when they discovered what Jimmy had negotiated on behalf of the United States. So in this case, with Tehran, Israel's threats of attack similarly focused Tehran's leaders on the penalties of defiance. And back in the 90s, it was the discussion that the U.S. might be attacking North Korea. It tends to focus one's mindset. Four, even a final agreement is never final. Vague text allows countries to cheat while still semi-legitimately claiming compliance. And like a good defense lawyer, Pyongyang used ambiguity to obfuscate and avoid punishment. And to prevent a crisis and a collapse of the negotiations, policymakers become more willing to negotiate away previous resolutions, treaties, UN resolutions, and even their own laws, or to simply not enforce them. Five, verify, verify, verify. Ronald Reagan's dictum of trust but verify was reflected in the extensively detailed verification protocols that the U.S. negotiated with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. I was a member of one of the treaty negotiation teams overseas, and we had incredibly detailed verification protocols as well as the text of the overall agreement. And the six-party talks collapsed back in 2007, 2008, since North Korea balked at the proposed verification regime. And the subsequent disclosure of the uranium program would necessitate far more intrusive, far more extensive verification than what North Korea walked away from the negotiations back at the tail end of the Bush administration. Number six, arms control advocates reject evidence of cheating. Pyongyang and Tehran have both serially deceived, denied, and defied the international community. Yet arms control proponents responded to growing evidence of North Korean cheating, and I would argue Iranian cheating, by doubting, dismissing, deflecting, deliberating, debating, delaying, and eventually dealing. And those experts initially rejected intelligence reports of North Korea's plutonium program, then the uranium program, and then North Korean involvement in building the Syrian reactor that Israel bombed in 2007. And nowadays what we see is experts downplaying North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities. What we hear is after every success by North Korea, it's like, well, yes, but I still think it's years away from them accomplishing the next task. And of course, they've been saying that for several years. Number 7, evidence of cheating doesn't arrive gift-wrapped. And after decades of debating whether Iran even had a nuclear weapons program, experts now claim that the Iranians are 2 months away from the threshold and that U.S. intelligence will now be able to quickly and unequivocally identify cheating and then convince U.S. policymakers and UN representatives to reimpose sufficient penalties to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons all within a year. I was an intelligence analyst. It's a tough job. It is really hard to find the smoking gun. It's usually a cumulative effort, and you never have enough information, and it's very hard to have 100% certainty in the estimates, let alone trying to convince a policymaker to say, hi, sir, I just kicked in your door to tell you that your legacy agreement is likely to fail, that they're cheating. I think you ought to reverse your policy. Well, that's not usually likely to happen. Number 8, the international community doesn't snap back. The UN has shown a remarkable ability to emit really a timid squeak of indignation when its resolutions are blatantly violated, and then only after extensive negotiations and compromise. And hampered by both Chinese and Russian obstructionism in the Security Council, the UN is usually limited to a lowest common denominator response, whether it's on sanctions or the wording of the resolution itself. Number 9, be wary of the administration's promises to increase pressure. Obama claims that North Korea is the most isolated, the most sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth. It is simply not true. The Obama administration has been pulling its punches on sanctions towards North Korea. They haven't even fully implemented U.S. laws, and it's pursued really a policy of timid incrementalism in enforcing our own laws, let alone UN resolutions, against North Korean illicit activities and violations. We've imposed measures on other countries that we haven't levied on North Korea. We've targeted fewer North Korean entities than those of the Balkans, of Burma, Cuba, Iran, and Zimbabwe. We have twice as many Zimbabwe entities on the unilateral U.S. sanctions list as North Korean entities. And despite a year and a half since the release of the UN Commission of Inquiry report that concluded North Korea's violations of human rights was so systemic and widespread and egregious as to constitute crimes against humanity, the U.S. has yet to take any action against any North Korean entity. In contrast, we identified by name and sanctioned by name the presidents of Belarus and Zimbabwe. Right now, the U.S. has 0, yes, 0 North Korean entities on any kind of sanctions list for human rights violations. We haven't identified North Korea as a money laundering concern like we did with Iran and other countries. So really, we've been pulling the punches. There's so many more things we could do with existing legislation. Number 10 and final, negotiations allow inching across red lines. That this alternating provocative behavior, this willingness or seeming willingness to negotiate, enabled North Korea and Iran to manipulate the international community in a timidity by maintaining the strategic ambiguity for so long on their nuclear programs. Both Pyongyang and Tehran, were like the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. They gained international acceptance of activities that were previously declared unacceptable. And proponents of the Iran deal dismiss criticism that it allows Tehran to have nuclear capabilities that were precluded by a number of UN resolutions. And a lot of times it's, well, they argue that you can't expect Iran to give up capabilities that they devoted so much resources as well as national pride to develop. You can't expect them to give up everything. Well, that's what the UN resolutions call for, both in the Iranian case and the North Korean case. And so finally, in conclusion, if nuclear negotiations were to resume with North Korea, Pyongyang would cite the Iran precedent and demand far less restrictive terms than the current UN resolutions call for on Pyongyang. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Bruce, that's exceedingly helpful, I think, to really have the side-by-side of these two very malevolent actors and tease out the interconnections between them. To the extent that we've learned anything from the North Korean experience, can you shed light on whether, as has been speculated by some, they have pursued an EMP or perhaps a super EMP capability? And if so, what would you say were the chances that that technology might have migrated to Iran as part of their cooperation in that space?
There have been a few reports about an EMP weapon by North Korea. I mean, very sketchy, very very sporadic. So really, we know even less about that kind of program than the nuclear program, which is very difficult to get information. My sense would be they'd be focused more on a straightforward nuclear weapon. I think that's where they're devoting their resources, devoting their attention. We think they have, depending on the estimates, 8 to 12, perhaps 8 to 16 nuclear weapons. I think they have achieved miniaturization. I think they have mated it with their medium-range ballistic missile, the Nodong, whereas others still think it's years away. But they may be working towards it, but very, very little information.
If I may just follow up on that, I'd encourage you, if you're interested in that topic, to talk with Dr. Peter Pry, who is among those who's been teaching me about it. And two things that he points to are, one, that as part of the EMP Threat Commission, on which he served as a staff member, their conversations with the Russians led to a disclosure that the Russians had given the North Koreans a super EMP weapon design. And also the results of the nuclear testing that North Korea, probably Iran too, has done in North Korea with the low seismic signatures would be consistent with an EMP design, he thinks. So anyway.
Right. It's a possibility. It's just
it's worrying if it's in either of their hands, let alone both. Fred?
Right.
What was behind the recent tensions between North and South Korea, and do you believe that the North is afraid of the Park government, and that may keep them from engaging in the type of military attacks like the sinking of that South Korean sub and the shelling of that South Korean island a few years ago?
Right. The landmine crisis. When I was in Seoul, I flew in on a Monday night. I went to sleep with emails still coming from journalists of, we're in a quasi-state of war. How close to war will we get? I woke up at 3 in the morning, checked the email, and there was a long list of new emails of, they just signed an agreement 20 minutes ago. How close to peace will we get and unification? So, I sort of rubbed my eyes, put the, pot of coffee on, and realized I had to write something. So within 9 hours of my arriving, the crisis had been solved, so I take full credit for it. But it really is a strange incident. I mean, I can't imagine, on the one hand, Kim Jong-un directing his generals, put one landmine south of the military demarcation line. It's just too low a detail. On the other hand, given the North Korean society, I can't imagine a colonel on his own initiative saying, I'm going to do something different. And, we have people infiltrating into the South as part of really a graduation ceremony for the Reconnaissance General Bureau. But I can't imagine a colonel or a general doing it on his own initiative. So I think the reality is somewhere in between. What it may be is Kim Jong-un directing his generals, be more assertive, be bolder in confronting and testing South Korea, but without giving the level of detail. So in a way, I think they stumbled into the crisis and then perhaps stumbled their way out. What is interesting is when I talked to Blue House officials and others in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were saying what was surprising was how strongly North Korea reacted to the propaganda loudspeakers. You know, what they said was, when they maimed the 2 South Korean soldiers, they could have responded in kind, try to maim or kill North Korean soldiers. But they said that would only be directed against the soldiers. It wouldn't hurt the regime. What they wanted to do was do something that was more directed at the regime leadership and hurt the regime by doing the propaganda broadcasts. But they didn't realize how strong a reaction it would get. And then that led to the exchange of artillery fire. And North Korea fired 2 shots into the South. And when the South realized nothing had been hit, when they responded with 26 or 39 shells, I think it was probably okay, just find a nice patch of dirt and launch, artillery shells there. No one was hurt on the South side with the artillery, so let's not escalate further, but let's show a firm response. What they said was during the negotiations, the North only had one item on the agenda. It was stop the propaganda. They were so nervous about whether it's regime stability or people learning the truth, that's what they focused on. There was no discussion or demand for ending the combined U.S.-ROC military exercises, ending of the South Korean sanctions, all of that. So it shows how susceptible they are to psychological operations. So I think in the follow-up to this agreement, that the South should make very clear to the North that if it does another provocation, not only will the loudspeakers go on, that there's going to be a lot more massive psyops, whether it's drones flying on each coast transmitting into the country, the leaflets, propaganda leaflets, and also I think South Korea should say we're pulling out of the Kaesong industrial zone, which is providing sort of record high amounts of money to North Korea. I think they are concerned by the Park Geun-hye administration. She clearly has responded firmly into every North Korean provocation. And also, even if we think back to Lee Myung-bak, they had the shelling of the island in November of 2010. A month later, South Korea was going to do a military anti-submarine exercises. A number of people in Washington wanted to sit on our erratic South Korean ally. Don't do that. It's dangerous. It'll escalate tensions. North Korea has vowed to attack your ships. South Korea went ahead. North Korea didn't do anything. We don't know if they were planning on attacking or not attacking, but I think the resolve showed by South Korea was a good message to send, and I think the response they did to this landmine and artillery was also a good step. So, President Park, I don't think is desperate for an inter-Korean summit. I think she's will remain principled in responding to any provocation. So I think North Korea has learned a bit about her backbone.
Puzzles about North Korea that I've never really gotten good answers to. Number one, I never understand China's motivation in really backing this rather strange regime. And secondly, this extremely poor, backward country expended the resources to actually miniaturize nuclear weapons components. I mean, is it really that easy? And how did this backward country get it done?
Right. Well, the puzzle, those are 2 good puzzles, and one even those of us who are supposedly experts, struggle with. One time I was doing a series of radio interviews from home, and my wife sat in to listening to them. And when I finished, she kind of looked at me with a puzzled look, saying, "You say I don't know a lot, and yet they keep calling you." So in sort of my best radio announcer voice, I was like, "Yes, I say I don't know, but I say it with great authority and with great conviction." So anyway, they still call. On China, the relationship really is never the lips and teeth that people think of, that old phrase from the 1950s that the North Koreans hated even then. Relations under Kim Il-sung were good or okay, but even then he played off the Soviet Union and China against each other so that neither superpower had a lot of leverage over little North Korea. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually sort of the reality. relations deteriorated under Kim Jong-il, and now they're even worse under Mini-Me. So that now, he hasn't even left the country in his 3.5 years. He hasn't met with, senior Chinese officials. I think maybe the best way is an analogy of if North Korea is sort of the troubled teenager with an affinity for handguns and a history of violent behavior, China is the father who lives just down the hall, and the Americans are the policemen who come knocking on the door saying, your kid just got in trouble, he just did something at school, we want you to go down the hall and punish him. And I think China's like, oh, I live with the kid. I go to sleep at night. I don't have a lock on my door. I don't know what he's going to do to me, to himself, to the neighbors. I doubt this evidence you have. And oh, by the way, he never would have done what he didn't do if you would give him a job and a car and more economic benefits. So China really is more interested in preventing a crisis on their borders than trying to maintain denuclearization or achieve denuclearization. So they keep the check flowing as a way of, through the economic engagement, sort of to keep the engines running in North Korea, such as it is, to prevent a crisis. And so therefore, when some provocation happens, they have this value neutral, oh, can't you two Koreas stop provoking each other? Well, only one Korea is provoking. Only one's attacking the other. But they just don't want to press the issue because they're afraid of what would happen. And on the backward, poor country, yeah, they are. But they do devote resources to where they want to. It's like the Soviet Union when I used to work Soviet military issues at the agency. They put the technology where they need to. And back during the Sony hack, before the government came out and said, yes, North Korea was behind it, I did a number of interviews where the announcer would usually say, oh, look, here's the famous nighttime satellite photo of North Korea. It's all dark and it's very lit in South Korea. These guys couldn't possibly have done it. They can't even keep the light bulb going. But again, it's where they want to devote the resources. They have a unit that has 6,000 or so cyber warriors. U.S. and South Korean intelligence officials have publicly said North Korea is one of the top 5, perhaps top 3 cyber nations in the world for cyber operations. They've been responsible for a number of psyops against others. So they have the ability to do very sophisticated cyber operations. Similarly with nuclear. I think one thing that's sort of telling is if you ask any expert on South Asia, is the Pakistan Ghauri missile nuclear capable? Yes, of course, no doubt, 100% certainty. Okay, how about North Korea's no-dong missile? I don't think those Koreans have figured it out. It's really complicated. Well, the original Ghauris were North Korean no-dong missiles. It'd be totally 100% made in North Korea, shipped to Pakistan, just like the Shahid 3 was a no-dong. They gave it a local paint job and paraded it through the streets, and it was claimed to be indigenously produced. A.Q. Khan, the mastermind of the Pakistan nuclear program, he said things such as, the North Korean scientists showed us how to put a warhead on a missile. The North Korean warheads were a work of art compared to ours, and yet people don't think North Korea has the capability. So again, they put their money where they want to.
Can we take one more question if there is one? If not, Bruce, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Superb presentation.